I'm from the City of London Police, and I am here to talk about duty of care responsibilities in terms of your employees. But I'm here to talk about it under a very, very specific umbrella. First of all, I just want to give you a very quick introduction to who the City of London Police is. Is there anybody here who doesn't know who we are? Is there anybody who does? A few. So quite a lot of liars. Essentially, the City of London Police is the smallest territorial police in the country. We're responsible territorially for just the City of London itself, which is where we are. That's obviously a map of London. We're the little tiny bit in the middle, the bit that matters, we like to think. And the rest of it is policed by somebody else. Now, obviously, this is a map of England and Wales, or after the next Scottish referendum, I think. That'll be what the UK looks like. But we also have responsibility for fraud and economic crime as a whole across England and Wales. Jokes aside, Scottish legislation is different, as is that of Northern Ireland, so our responsibility is there a little bit less. So we're here, really, to tell you what it is about these four topics which is relevant to you and to your employees. Now, my role is very much going out and talking to people who work in compliance teams or who work in cyber response teams and trying to get to grips with them with what some of these issues are. And I'm aware that some of the understanding of these issues might be a little bit more limited within this room. And really what I want to do is try and take what I know and turn it into what we see as the HR role in this, or how it is that you can best look after your employees without getting too technical in each of these areas. So fraud, first of all. First thing to say is that fraud isn't about a combination of your legal services, your IT teams, your compliance teams, and all those sorts of things. Fraud really needs a whole corporate response to it. If HR isn't part of it, this causes quite significant problems because actually the employee side of things is very, very important, whether you're talking about insider fraud or indeed looking after your staff. Both of those things really need to follow what we would call the golden strand of three different things that, from an HR point of view. Those are making sure that communication is going out to your staff and they understand what the risks are and what their responsibilities are. Secondly, some of you will probably have responsibility for making sure that training is adequate across those things. Again, compliance are going to have a large role in that, but actually I think the HR side of it goes a little bit deeper. And thirdly, making sure that your procedures are right. And again, we're not talking legal and compliance procedures. We're talking about staff support procedures here. What is it that you do if your staff are worried about fraud? What is it you do if your staff are victims of fraud? And how do you help them? Then we come on to the golden rules, or purple rules, I guess. We've got a number of different things here which will be very, very familiar to most people who work in the compliance arena, but perhaps less familiar for people in the HR field. When we talk about counter-fraud and avoiding all of these sorts of things, it's very important that we have a supportive working culture. It's very important that people are doing regular risk assessments and so on, but actually, when we get down to about here, we're talking about effective procedures for people to be able to report it. If somebody knows that there's fraud going on somewhere within your company, they need a way of knowing that they can report their manager, report their C-level executive who's part of it, and so on, and that it's not going to come back to bite them. And actually, dealing with the stress and the worry around these sorts of issues can be a very, very significant problem for staff, and it leads to a huge amount of underreporting. You also probably in a very good position to enable what we would consider to be organisational learning here, where you're reviewing your cases. Is there somebody in a room who's talking to people either who've been victims of, or their departments have been victims of fraud, or people who've been involved in committing fraud against your company? How much can you help as confidential agents, I suppose, within your company to really get some of the facts out and try and improve fraud defences across the organisation? So why is fraud important? Well, every organisation in this room, I would wager, probably suffers about 5% loss of their GDP, their total output to fraud. There's a lot of studies in that area, and it doesn't really make a difference whether you're a small, medium enterprise or whether you're a very large corporate body. Figure tends to be the same. There are some exceptions, some are higher, some are a little bit lower, but generally speaking, you are suffering massive losses to fraud somewhere in your organisation. These are some of the common things which you should probably be aware of. Mandate fraud, which is where people are essentially changing payment details, calling in and faking a supplier, changing bank accounts, those sorts of things. 127 million of that reported in 2015. The big watchword at the moment is about CEO fraud, and in the first half of this year, we at the City Police had 1,000 different reports of this, the highest one of which was worth £18.5 million. And this is where somebody is basically calling in, pretending to be some sort of C-level executive, calling somebody, whether it's in a finance department or on a trading floor, and using their position, which of course isn't a genuine one, to force people to do a trade, transfer money somewhere, or push across accounts. I think this particular example was something like a merger or an acquisition. Somebody saying that it was secret, their line manager wouldn't know about it, nobody else would know about it, but they needed the money quickly for this deal to go forwards, and that they'd singled this person out as somebody who could get the job done. It's important as well to differentiate what you will see in the newspapers as scams from these sorts of frauds. The average CEO fraud is worth about £35,000 to the fraudster. Now, put that into context, that is the national average wage, okay? In other words, this is big business. It's sophisticated. We're not talking, when we talk about fraud, really, we're not talking about people who do a shoddy job with a driveway or something like that. These are people who are career fraudsters, who are from organised crime groups more often than not, and who are very, very sophisticated. And I'll put it to you that actually the value of some of these, in fact, makes it more worth doing in some cases than your average menial job in a company. Don't do it, though. It's also worth thinking about how cybercrime kind of relates into this. Now, as HR professionals, you need to have an understanding of what the risks are, perhaps on a slightly lesser extent than perhaps a compliance member of staff, but you certainly need to know what the real risks are. So we're talking about training, we're talking about these people understanding what the issues are, understanding what to look for. We're talking about embedding this within corporate culture, and we're talking about how to report this. One big problem with fraud is insiders. Now, is there anybody in the room who regularly, other than when you start up a new employee, you regularly vet your employees or you regularly check up on their welfare? That's quite encouraging, but that there are a few. It is an obvious weakness. Over the course of the employee lifestyle, people change their outgoings and so on. We've heard a lot about how people may succumb to various types of addiction or those sorts of things. People's financial circumstances change. It won't be too long before some of the people in the room, and possibly some already have experienced this, but your children might go to university or something like that. It's a massive financial drain. And in a lot of circumstances, it provides an incentive for people to try and push their luck. It happens quite a lot. And actually, understanding what people's motivations might be in terms of fraud can go a very, very long way to trying to circumvent that. People who are getting into a lot of debt, I saw debt management come up earlier, was another great example of this. Now, often fraudsters aren't greedy so much as doing things out of an absolute necessity. They have a real problem. They see an easy way of exploiting a system. Perhaps they don't think that they're going to get caught, or that actually the company's not going to miss 20, 30 grand. In some cases, they might be right. The company might not miss that sort of money. But it is a crime, and it is resulting in losses to your company, and it is happening probably on a larger scale than you realise. It's also, just before I move on to bribery, I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of employee problems that can carry over from their home life might result from being a victim of fraud in their personal life as well. It happens quite a lot, whether somebody tries to buy a car on Gumtree and it turns out not to be a real car, something like that. It sounds very, very simple, and sometimes when you hear these sorts of reports or you read about them, you might think, how on earth could anybody fall for that? Again, fraud these days is much more of a career choice. It's very, very sophisticated people. They can scam pretty much anybody. And there's, in many ways, no shame in being the victim of fraud. Bribery is perhaps a slightly easier topic to talk about when it comes to your responsibilities in HR. And actually, A lot of that is because the law's a lot clearer. You're probably all vaguely familiar with the Bribery Act. For those of you who aren't, you're not allowed to pay bribes. You're not allowed to ask for bribes. Okay. There's also a corporate responsibility to try and make sure that nobody in your company is either asking for or paying bribes. And this extends across the world, which is very, very important. Now, actually, I've poorly chosen the picture on this slide and the next one because neither of them are set in the UK. And I think it's important as well to get across the message, bribery happens in the UK quite a lot. I remember talking to somebody once who was bidding for an NHS contract, for example, but had elected to pull out of the process, and I asked him why. And he said because winning the contract would have cost him 3 Mercedes. And it's not a sort of scare story. This sort of thing happens all the time. There is a lot of corruption. There is a lot of bribery in our world. But crucially, what you need to be able to do is work with your compliance teams and ask some of these questions. Do your employees actually know what the law is? Do they know what it is overseas? In the overwhelming majority of countries, it is illegal to pay bribes, no matter what anybody tells you, no matter what somebody tells you at a port or an airport. It is illegal. But there are probably a few exceptions. I should imagine that South Sudan might be one of them. And Russia. That's a joke. Right. But crucially, what happens if your staff are asked to pay a bribe? It happens. It happens to everybody. It happens to me when I travel abroad. Everybody gets across sometimes. Under UK legislation, you cannot pay bribes under any circumstances. Okay? It's illegal, and you can be held responsible for it here. And more importantly, for some of us, your directors can be responsible for not only the actions of themselves, but also their employees and any third-party agents that are related to your firm. So arguably, you have a duty of care to your company, but also to your employees. Now, coming back to what I was saying earlier about stress and trying to manage those sorts of things, one of the big problems with bribery is that people don't always know what they're getting into. You send them abroad. I think this is a picture of Pakistan, but my recent experience in Zimbabwe is quite similar to this. Went out there. I had no idea what some of the risks were going to be. And it is very, very difficult. I wasn't really expecting there to be any call for somebody to be asking me for bribes. And with hindsight, that was quite naive. What perhaps you should have done, I should point out that this was a personal trip and not a job one, so just in case my manager's listening. Now, we've got a real need to use proper risk control agencies whenever you go anywhere. There's actually one in the building today, but what they can do, or you may have in-house capacity for this, is to provide a proper assessment of what the problems are likely to be, also to get a very strong awareness of what cultural issues are, what the political landscape is, and so on, so that whenever you're going abroad or you're sending your employees abroad, you know what they're getting into, and they know what they're getting into. You also need to keep people updated. You need to supply briefings and make sure they're well supported when they're overseas. No matter where they are, it's always possible to contact anybody in the world, pretty much. Any kind of changes in the landscape, it's important to know. But in terms of reducing their stress, it's very, very helpful to know that they can contact the head office, they can contact somebody, whether that's you guys in HR, whether that's somebody else, and they can get support for any situation they're currently in. But of course, it does happen. Now, the law requires you not to pay a bribe. I would argue that if you come across guys in this sort of situation, it's probably a good idea to do it anyway and worry about the consequences later. There is a sort of procedure in place for this. Essentially, this is the most important thing to remember when it comes to bribery. Okay? Don't expect to pay it. There shouldn't be an expectation that there is, but remain calm at all times. Okay? As soon as you lose your head, you've lost it, and they know that they're going to get some money out of you. Take simple steps. Make sure that you're not carrying around huge buckets full of cash whenever you go anywhere, and try to not be too flashy with what you're wearing and the jewellery and so on. But crucially, ask exactly what it is that you're paying money for. Ask whether or not you can have a receipt for it. Make sure that you know what it is that you're supposed to be paying. So if somebody says there's a handling fee on this, is there actually a handling fee on this? Because sometimes it could be legitimate. Probably not in the armed roadblock scenario, but there might be some others. Make sure that you know who to contact higher up the chain of command. If you're likely, and your risk assessment's told you you're likely to have some problems with local police, it's not a bad idea to see if your company can make some contacts with people higher up the chain that they can call in these sorts of scenarios. It can help to call bluff. If a policeman on the corner is standing there and asking you for a little fee for something or a minor fine, and he's threatening to take you to jail, he probably doesn't want to. The reason being that it's all about his motivations. He wants to be there fleecing tourists, fleecing people from other companies and those sorts of things. He doesn't want to take you to jail because he's going to lose his income potential. On the other hand, if it does look like he's about to put handcuffs on you, for God's sake, pay the man. You don't want to end up in somewhere like that. Last of all, make sure you keep very, very stringent records of all the bribes that you're asked to pay. Make sure you get as much paperwork as you possibly can, and make sure that everything is recorded and absolutely transparent when you get back to the UK. It's the best thing you can do in terms of following things, and of course it informs organisational learning when you get back. We had problems here. How can we deal with it in future? How can we make sure there's no future infringements? Cybersecurity then. When it comes to cybersecurity, again, it's a little bit like fraud. Everybody thinks that it's something that probably doesn't happen to them, and in fact, it probably has already. Everybody's had a hacked account. Everybody looks like they've got spam from somewhere. All of these sorts of things go on a very, very regular basis. The crucial thing is knowing that your employees know what the risks are online. Now, whether that's a risk to themselves or whether that's a risk to the organisation. Going back to what I said earlier, and I'm talking about cyber-enabled fraud when I talk about this. These people are after money. They want an advantage out of you, and because of the high values that are involved, it's well worth them doing their research properly. Phishing, or trying to get contact details, eventually trying to upload malware onto your computer and so on, is all done with an understanding of how it is that they can extract money from your organisation. And the more that you can help your staff by understanding how it works and pushing the risks through, the better. Crucially, if there's a policy like don't bring in your own devices, don't plug in your iPhones into the computers, those sorts of things, it's important that employees understand why not, because there are valid reasons for these policies, and actually a very quick briefing note circulated by your departments, perhaps in conjunction with IT security, can go a very, very long way to understanding it. I'll rush on a bit. Last of all, I just want to talk about duty of care when it comes towards terrorism. Now, I've identified this I've split this into two distinct parts. First of all, there's to do with the UK. And again, it comes down to those kind of golden threads. What training are you putting in place for people? What's the procedure if it happens? And how do you communicate with people? Being honest, it's extremely unlikely that somebody's ever going to be caught up in, this was the 7/7 bombings. It does happen. I'm sure everybody knows somebody who was involved. But actually, in terms of the number of direct victims, it was quite small. The big impact was the welfare to deal with it, dealing with the anxiety of people travelling in, dealing with how people were going to work, and all of those are the regular concerns which you can deal with in a very straightforward way, really. What are your business continuity plans, and how easy is it to get people to work off-site to minimise things? So people might not feel like doing it straight away, but I dare say the day after a major incident, actually, everybody wants life to go on just as normal. Make sure that people are familiar with what they should do if there is a bomb threat in your building, particularly if you're a high-value target, and also that people are familiar with the Run, Hide and Tell initiative. The two biggest threats at the moment are active explosive devices and active shooters. There's no point trying to follow the American procedure of fighting these people. If you've ever experienced what it's like for an unarmed person to try and take on somebody with an automatic weapon, I wouldn't recommend it. It's not a great idea. I also just want to quickly mention the idea of making sure that everybody who works within a receptionist role or a building security role has some contact with the city police. We have a couple of excellent initiatives called Project Argus and Project... What? Griffin, thank you. They're very, very good in terms of recognising active, hostile reconnaissance, and also planning for the worst should an event happen. And then finally, just kind of moving on to what it is like overseas. And again, this is all about making sure that your staff are informed about what the risks realistically are, having a plan in place for if something bad does happen and you need to contact people, also to perhaps help them to contact their families, and basically covering off all the bases. Does your insurance cover travel home, for example? When is it you need to think about cancelling any trips that are related to this sort of stuff? And in essence, just making people feel that as an organisation, you've got all of these sorts of things pre-thought out and covered. And as soon as you're in that sort of situation, people won't worry about it so much anymore. So just to summarise, these are the 3 things that I hope that you can take away from this. There are 3 key things in terms of your duty of care to your employees across all of these issues. Communication is the most important thing. It reduces stress immediately. People won't worry about it if they think that there's a plan and they're fairly convinced that it's a robust one. Make sure that everybody who needs to be is adequately trained, particularly if they're going abroad, particularly if they're going into an unknown situation. And finally, make sure that whatever happens, your response plans, particularly in terms of communicating with your staff if they're forced to be off-site or perhaps forced to relocate to a different hotel, something like that, everybody knows what they're meant to be doing and who they need to call if everything goes wrong. That's it. Thank you very much.